this time, we're going to call Dr. Harry Krop.
All right, Dr. Krop, you'll come forward. Good afternoon. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do, Your Honor.
Go ahead and have a seat. Counsel, your witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Krop, could you please state your full name for the record?
My name is Harry Krop, K-R-O-P.
And what is your occupation?
I'm a licensed psychologist in the state of Florida. I've been licensed since 1971. My specialty area is forensic psychology.
And in specifically the field of forensic psychology, approximately how many examinations have you conducted?
Well, I've been involved, as I said, I was licensed in 1971. At the time, I came to Gainesville to do a postdoctoral internship at the VA Medical Center in Gainesville, and I was asked to be a staff psychologist after I finished the internship. And then in 1977-78, I went part-time, opened up a private practice, and started doing forensic psychology about 4 or 5 years later when I was asked to do an evaluation actually at the VA. This was after I left the VA, for a Vietnam veteran who was on death row, and I was asked to see him to determine whether he had post-traumatic stress disorder from being in the Vietnam War. And from that point on, I began getting more and more referrals in forensic psychology, which is basically evaluating individuals in the either criminal arena for competency or sanity or mitigation. And then I also do a lot of civil evaluations, which would be sometimes head injuries, individuals who are recovering from sexual assault. I started the first sex offender treatment program in the state of Florida back in '77.
Your Honor, the state has no objection to this. Dr. Krop's credentials.
Thank you, Your Honor.
We stipulate his qualification.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Were you retained by counsel in this case to evaluate Spencer Pearson?
I was.
And did you, in fact, conduct that evaluation?
Yes, I did.
And during the course of that evaluation, did you administer testing?
Yeah, let me say that I have probably saw Spencer maybe more times than certainly the majority of people that I've evaluated. I saw him, I believe, 8 times. 2 of the times were in person at the jail where I did neuropsychological testing, and then the other times were for remotely from my office through Zoom. He was given a private room at the jail. Most of those times his attorney was present using a laptop, which allowed me to use Zoom to interview him. He was also seen on one of those occasions, perhaps 2 occasions, by one of my forensic assistants who obtained some additional history for me and also assisted in some of the testing. So I accumulated the number of hours that I saw him, and it totals 18 and a half hours over that period of time. That does not include some of the testing that he did on his own, which was the personality testing. So to get back to your question, I conducted, in addition to interviews, we conducted psychological testing, which included sort of traditional personality testing, and then I also did neuropsychological testing.
And generally, can you tell the court what the results of your evaluation were?
Well, the results were interesting, and let me divide them up into the 2 types of testing I did. The neuropsychological testing, when I do neuropsychological testing, there's probably about 250 or more tests that are considered neuropsychological in nature. That is measuring a person's functioning and then seeing if there are any deficits and then correlating them with different parts of the brain. Since I certainly wasn't familiar with Mr. Pearson Spencer until the evaluation, and there was, when I first saw him to do the testing, which was just, again, out of caution, I selected tests that were sort of screening tests to measure different parts of the brain and different functions, most of them cognitive in nature, attention, memory, intelligence, things like that.
And I had forgotten to ask you, I asked you about tests that you had administered, Spencer. In addition to administering tests for Spencer, did you have the opportunity to interview any of his family members or test to them also?
Yes, following the evaluation, I interviewed family members, and my assistant also interviewed them, and then they, in addition to them being interviewed, the father, the mother, and the sister were interviewed, and then the father and mother were also interviewed by me at my office. They came to my office for an interview. I also interviewed the mother and father again just a couple of weeks ago after reviewing some of the records, including a report of Dr. Davis. And if I can say, prior and during the evaluation, in addition to my interviews with Spencer, you and your office provided jail records for me, police reports, video surveillance, medical records from UF Health, which is where he went after the incident. There was also records from Baptist. There were records, his school records. There were records from a therapist, I believe, at a place called Here Tomorrow. I don't think they call themselves therapists, but for the purpose of this, he went for counseling.
We could call them lay
they were more peer kinds of counseling. I reviewed records from Rainbow Pediatric Center, St. Johns County Fire and Rescue. I already said St. Johns County Jail, school records, Shands, and even Baptist Health. And then, as I said, I interviewed 3 family members. After the initial interview with family members, after getting some history, I also asked them to complete each of them independently questionnaires which rated, they're called autism rating scales, and I had them independently complete those questionnaires because from the history they gave I had some concerns that had not been addressed before, and that was whether Spencer would meet criteria of being on the autism spectrum. So that was another area that I addressed.
And when you say you evaluated them independently, you're saying that each of them was evaluated separately from one another? Each
of them completed the questionnaires and the rating scales independently.
And what were the results, and how close, if they were close, were those results from the family on the autism scale?
It was very interesting because although they didn't necessarily they were not necessarily identical with regard to some of the individual areas, such as communication and social and academic. Those are all some of the different areas. But the total scores that they came up with were incredibly consistent. I think there was an 82, an 81, and an 82, which all of those are classified as being in the autism spectrum. based on the history they provided and based on the autism rating scales, I did classify Spencer on the autism spectrum.
However, you're not testifying that he committed this offense because he was autistic.
No, I'm not saying that at all, but I think some of the contributing factors in terms of that are associated with his personality style over the years and his behavior over the years, that's what I took into consideration, both on the history that he gave, the history that the family gave, and also some of the testing, but also, of course, on my own interviews, which I indicated was fairly extensive. And in all honesty, some of that 18 and a half hours were spent with Spencer talking about sports, because that was sort of a passion of his with his father. And it was one of the reasons that I was able to, I think, establish rapport with him quite easily, given his circumstances. Although it was explained to him that initially the evaluation would be confidential, he appeared to trust me right from the beginning.
Now, I took us off on a little bit of a tangent, so let's go back to, can you generally tell us what the results of your evaluation was?
Well, let's start off with the testing. The neuropsychological testing did not show any neuropsychological impairment, and by that I mean that the areas that I assessed, such as intelligence, he came out in the average range of intelligence, which is pretty consistent with his GPA level. It was somewhere like in the 40th percentile of the population. His IQ came out, and he came out higher on verbal than on nonverbal, which was a little surprising given his sort of social inadequacies in certain areas. So the neuropsychological testing were not significant, but as I said, I measured primarily cognitive areas such as memory, concentration, attention, as well as some executive functions, which are the higher level cognitive. So I didn't see any impairment in those areas that were tapped by the testing. They also have inherently, within the test themselves, there are measures to determine whether he might be malingering. In other words, exaggerating his deficits, and the evidence showed that there was no malingering, that his functioning level was pretty much consistent with what his potential would be on those particular areas. The personality testing, some of it was evident in terms of his significant level of anxiety, significant level of depression, and the specific, such as the Beck Anxiety Inventory and the Beck Depression Scale. Those tests measure both current levels of depression, well, mostly current levels of depression, but the history he provided was that this depression was not only situational in terms of his legal plight and his feelings of guilt and remorse and so forth, but that the depression and the anxiety were chronic in nature, and that was in part based on his own self-report and the family's report to me. So
let me just interrupt you for 1 minute. By chronic in nature, you mean that it was existing prior to his relationship with the victim in this case?
Absolutely. His sister, and again, I'm doing this without looking at my notes, but basically his sister reported that from the time she can remember, he's had anxiety and depression, which worsened when they moved to Florida. I think he was in the 5th grade. I'm doing that by memory. But it was difficult for him in terms of the move, especially with somebody with the kind of anxiety that he has. And again, I'm talking also about someone on the autism spectrum. They don't like change. So he's had anxiety from the time he was a little kid, according to family members. The sister appeared to, and I don't mean this as an insult, but the sister seemed to be more aware, and maybe it's because she spent more time even though she was older, and she seemed to be more sensitive of Spencer's mental health issues from the time he was a young kid. Even if he would go out with her in social situations, she was aware of that anxiety level. So the depression and the anxiety were chronic in nature. Now, the results of the two major personality tests, which are the Personality Assessment Inventory and the MMPI-3. I gave the MMPI-2 and the MMPI-3, and I'll explain why. The results were difficult to interpret in terms of a specific clinical profile. The reason being that the validity scale scores, and the reason these two tests are used, they're the most commonly used tests, is because they measure the person's validity in terms of taking the test. Was he or she overly defensive, or was he or she overly negative in terms of endorsing responses that may reflect significant pathology, significant mental health problems? So I couldn't interpret it per se, but what the test manual and the test interpretation report says is if the person has these possible exaggeration, go back and interview him and review the specific items that he endorsed which led to this high level of possible exaggeration.
And did you in fact do that?
Yes. Fortunately, I was able, especially because of Zoom and being able to do it remotely, I was able to go back and review. Actually, I went in person to review the items which he endorsed, and some of these were things like I hear voices, certain paranoid kinds of responses, and it was interesting because he was able to explain why he responded in a certain way to these particular items. And what he did was basically take things that are literal, things literally rather than sort of accepting them at a concrete level. For example, I am the target of a conspiracy. He answered yes for that. Now, most of the time when somebody endorses that, unless they're blatantly psychotic and delusional, that would be seen as maybe he's exaggerating. So when I talked to him about, and again, I'm just picking one item, he's talking about what he felt was after he broke up with Madison, his friend deserted him and was angry with him, and all the boys and all of his peers were talking about him and so forth. And whether that was true or not, he perceived that. And so based on his explanation of all of those items, I did not believe that he was exaggerating or malingering. And in fact, one of the things that the test manual suggests is the possibility that it's basically just a cry for help. It's not a person malingering, but he's in a desperate situation and he's crying out for help. And that really reflected where Spencer was and is in terms of when he was responding to the test. So I concluded from everything that I had that he was not purposely trying to malinger or look sicker than he is, but that a lot of the items, or he was actually feeling that way, especially with certain of the items that reflected depression, like questions like, I contemplate killing myself. Well, that was true. I have attempted to kill myself. That was true. And again, those are items that some people might look at as possible exaggeration. In Spencer's case, unfortunately, a lot of those things really did happen and were reflective of his true self-concept and his mental status.
And based upon your testing and your testing of the family and meetings and 18 hours of interviews, did you develop a diagnosis for Spencer?
I actually concluded and gave him several diagnoses as we sit here today. The two most important diagnoses, and I would like to elaborate after I give these diagnoses. I diagnosed him with major depressive disorder. I said in my report with psychotic features, and I could explain that, why I said that. Severe and chronic with multiple episodes. I also diagnosed him with social anxiety disorder. Again, I'll explain a little bit. It's also referred to as a social phobia. I diagnosed him as being on the autism spectrum disorder. I've already talked about that a little bit. At first, I thought possibly there was some bipolar disorder, but after further investigation, I ruled that out. So I did not have that diagnosis. So the three diagnoses that I gave him was the major depressive disorder, severe recurrent episode, social anxiety disorder, and autism spectrum disorder. If I can, I indicated that I reviewed a lot of collateral information, including medical records and psychiatric records.
And what are those records? Did those records also have diagnoses?
Yes. They also provided diagnoses. Some of them provided treatment of a limited nature. His jail records diagnosed him with major depressive disorder, recurrent, without psychosis. I think these are in order. The next one was Baptist Health, which is where he spent 4 or 5 days as an inpatient following a suicide attempt. They diagnosed him as major depressive disorder, severe single episode, which is all the history that they had. UF Health, which is where he was taken after he slit his throat. He was diagnosed with major depressive disorder, recurrent. And then Dr. Davis, who I read his report, he also diagnosed, and he evaluated him more recently, and Dr. Davis diagnosed him as just plain major depressive disorder. So as you can see, there is certainly consistency in diagnosing him with major depressive disorder. Dr. Davis also diagnosed him with social anxiety disorder, which is one of my diagnoses that I gave him. If I can elucidate a little bit, because I think it's important, Your Honor, to explain why I got those diagnoses. And again, most of these are not necessarily from the testing, some of them are, but from the history that was given. So what I'm using is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and that is the sort of the Bible that psychiatrists and psychologists rely on so that we can objectively determine. We don't all agree on the diagnoses, but it's a lot better than it was when I first started practicing 50 years ago, when it was hard for two people to come up with the same diagnosis. At least now there's some objective criteria. So a social anxiety disorder in general is, and the person needs to meet these particular criteria: marked fear or anxiety about one or more social situations in which the individual is exposed to possible scrutiny by others. Examples include social interactions such as having a conversation, and meeting unfamiliar people, or being observed eating or drinking and performing in front of others, such as giving a speech, sometimes even going to the bathroom in public. The second criteria is the individual fears that he will act in a way or show anxiety symptoms that will be negatively evaluated, such as that he'll be humiliated or embarrassed and might lead to rejection or offend others. One of the problems academically that Spencer had in school, which is why I think he didn't achieve as high a level as he possibly could have, was he was uncomfortable raising his hand in classes and afraid that if he answered a question, they might say no, and that it's wrong, and that he might be humiliated. The third criteria is that the social situations almost always provoke fear or anxiety, and then the social situations are avoided or endured when they are endured with intense fear or anxiety. The fear or anxiety is out of proportion to the actual threat posed by the social situation. The fear, anxiety, or avoidance is persistent, typically lasting for 6 or more months. The fear, anxiety, or avoidance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. The fear, anxiety, or avoidance is not attributable to physiological effects of a substance. The fear, anxiety, or avoidance is not better explained by the symptoms of another mental disorder, such as panic disorder or autism spectrum disorder. It also says that a person can have both autism spectrum disorder and social anxiety, but in reality, they're very similar. And
somewhat of an interplay between the two.
There's a lot of interplay. There's a lot of overlap between the two diagnoses. I think it's quite clear from what I just read that social anxiety disorder unfortunately perfectly fits Spencer throughout his whole life. The other diagnosis is the major depressive disorder. Again, looking at the DSM. The major depressive disorder, for that diagnosis to be met, 5 or more of the following symptoms have to be present.
Excuse me, it's 5. Is it 7 symptoms? Is it total of 7 symptoms?
There's actually 9 possible.
So 5 of 9 symptoms must be present.
Need to be met for major depressive disorder. Some of them, if there's less than 5, they still could be some type of depressive disorder, but major depressive disorder, which is the most serious of the depressive disorders, not only have to they be present, but they have to be present during the same 2-week period and represent a change from previous functioning. And at least one of the symptoms is either a depressed mood or a loss of interest or pleasure. So the criteria are depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day during that time period, meaning that the person feels sad, empty, or hopeless, or other people observe the kind of mood that the person is in. Secondly, markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day, nearly every day. Again, this is during a 2-week period. It doesn't mean throughout his lifetime. Significant weight loss, insomnia, or hypersomnia, meaning sleeping all the time, nearly every day. The next one, I'm not sure he met. So the first 4 I felt he met. The next one is psychomotor agitation, nearly every day as observed by others, although he does tend to shake and different parts of his body currently tend to shake and he has a tremor, but I don't think that fits him. fatigue or loss of energy. That's another one. Feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt, diminished ability to think or concentrate, or indecisiveness. And the last one is recurring thoughts of death. He certainly has 5, actually has more, which is why I diagnosed him with the specifier severe, because especially the suicide attempts and the recurrent thoughts of suicide, which unfortunately is still present in talking to Spencer, partly because of his legal plight, but because of his tremendous remorse and guilt for what he did to Madison. So those are the 2 major diagnoses that I think are relevant, particularly relevant to what led up to the incident in question.
With respect to these diagnoses, is it your professional opinion that those diagnoses existed prior to June 3rd, 2023?
Yes.
Now, we talk about psychosis. You're not claiming that he suffers from psychosis, are you?
No, he's not currently psychotic. I do think that he has demonstrated some features of psychosis based on family members telling me that during the time that he had broken up, after he had broken up, he started becoming increasingly paranoid. He thought people were breaking into his car, although that may have been reality. But he was worried that people were watching him and after him. So there were these paranoid features that family members reported to me. He also reported to me that he has a history of and is still hearing voices. When he described these voices, however, they were not really consistent with auditory hallucinations. They were more coping or features of the major depressive disorder, such as him having conversations. I mean, in jail, he's basically talking about having conversations with himself with these voices, but at the same time, they're saying negative things about him. But I am certainly not suggesting that he was psychotic at the time that he, at the time of the offense with regard to Madison.
And we lay people, we know some of the psychological terms, so we know psychotic, and then there's psychopathic. Is Spencer Pearson psychopathic?
Not at all. And the reason that's important is a psychopath is a trait that we often see with people with antisocial personality disorders, and certainly a lot of criminals that I have evaluated and that we see on TV on these shows, they're clearly psychopathic. These are people that don't care about other people at all. They're deceitful. They often have histories of violence and manipulation and so forth. None of the testing reflect any kind of psychopathic traits. The history that he gave me certainly does not reflect psychopathic traits, and the history that the parents gave me, they talk about him being kind and gentle and caring about others, and I know all of those traits are totally inconsistent and out of character for what he did to Madison. And I think that's important to see that this was a situational thing that happened, and all of these other factors that I'm talking about, I think, contributed to what happened on the day in question. But he's not a psychopath. That's important also in terms of looking ahead in the future, that it means that he is, and again, I know this sounds hypocritical, but he is not a risk to engage in future kind of violent behavior if you look at everything about him, and especially now that he has a sense of how medication can have a positive effect on him. He's been on medication since he's been in jail, and he's been compliant. It's medication for anxiety and medication to help him sleep. Unfortunately, and this is a negative thing, that he had an opportunity to be on medication before when he went to when he was taken to Baptist after a suicide attempt. They prescribed medication for him, I believe, and he was not compliant with that. He took it for a couple days. He said it gave him headaches, and we have a 17 at the time year-old, or maybe 18 at the time, but a teenager who, and we heard Dr. Ravina talk about feeling invincible, and also his depression was still very severe. His situation hadn't changed in terms of what happened between him and Madison, so he wasn't necessarily motivated to change. He had it in his mind at that time that he was going to kill himself, and he persisted with those thoughts, unfortunately. So he did not take the medication, and we can't go back in time and say if he took the medication this wouldn't have happened, but I think certainly given the positive effects that medication have had on him since he's been in jail, we can at least speculate that that was possible.
Did he indicate to you prior to this event that he had persistent ideations of suicide?
Yes, before the incident.
Yes.
Yes, he had been thinking about suicide since he broke up, or I should say Madison broke up with him. He'd been having suicidal thoughts.
And were they persistent?
They were persistent to the point where I think it was a few weeks, in my timeline, I'm trying to do this by full memory, but from a timeline, I think 2 or 3 weeks after the incident in question, I'm sorry, not after the incident, but after the breakup, the depression was obviously severe. He was laying on the couch, wouldn't go all the time. He wasn't eating and so forth. And he did attempt to kill himself. And he wrote I don't remember whether it was an email or a text to Madison, I believe, and maybe Madison's mother, that indicated that he was suicidal. And in fact, he did make an attempt on his life by tying a tie around his neck at night in his bedroom, in his closet. Didn't anticipate that somebody would find him, and his father or his parents did learn, I think, about the text or email that he sent, and they had been sleeping, and they went upstairs and found him, and my understanding, he had already turned color from the strangulation of his attempted hanging, so it appeared that this was a genuine suicide attempt.
Let's talk a little bit about recurrent depression, because if somebody's depressed, they're depressed. What makes it recurrent? Why is it a recurrent depression?
Well, the major depression is recurrent because, again, the major depressive diagnosis is based on somebody being seriously depressed, those 7 criteria, having at least 5 of those over a 2-week period. And he went through different periods of time when he was seriously depressed, would meet those criteria, and they occurred over different periods of time. But the most serious, of course, was after the breakup, when he basically thought his life was over. He was having trouble in school, and what preceded the first suicide attempt was he had a test the next day. He hadn't studied. He hadn't been able to study because all he could think about was Madison. So he had school stressors, and of course he kept obsessing about his breakup with Madison. and his coping skills were very inadequate. And so all of that together resulted in his belief that he'd be better off dead.
Are you aware if he ever went back to school after that suicide attempt?
I'm sorry?
Are you aware if he ever returned to school after that suicide attempt?
I don't think he did. I know before that he didn't go to prom. Again, this was after the breakup and how embarrassed he was and uncomfortable and depressed. And I know he didn't go to graduation. I don't think he went back to school, and I don't know how much school was left at that time.
And I think there's probably, as with all young people, there's maybe getting ready to break up, an official breakup. Whether or not he broke up before or after prom, he did not attend prom, correct?
That's correct.
Now, let me ask you another question. Can you opine about Spencer's emotional immaturity or maturity?
Well, let me say in general, this doesn't apply to every single individual, and I think Dr. Rubino made reference to this, but then said it was more in the psychologist's purview. He talked about the adolescent brain, and to make it simple and not get into highly technical stuff, the adolescent brain just means that certain parts of the brain, which is primarily the frontal lobe, which is the most important part of the brain, because it is called executive functions, meaning it controls inhibition, impulsivity, planning, problem solving, the things that executives need to be successful. And it's not yet fully developed in a 17 or 18-year-old, sometimes up to the age of 25. So all teenagers have to deal with that they're not fully capable of these higher function at a younger age. Emotional maturity is also to some degree associated with this underdevelopment. In Spencer's case, we also have these other issues like social anxiety, in which the person is not emotionally capable because of this disorder of dealing with social situations, dealing with trying to fit in, which is one of the important issues of social anxiety and autism as well, is there this desire to fit in. And it seems like the only time that he felt that he fit in was 2 times in his life. Once was playing football, because he was part of a group and they had a specific common denominator, even though socially he had issues with the other players at parties and stuff, but he felt good about playing football. And the other time that he felt normal, as he said, was when he was with Madison. She helped him feel positive about himself. She was popular herself, and for him to be dating somebody who was popular and had a lot of friends, that was a good time for him. But again, one of the reasons, and again, I've never talked or evaluated Madison, of course, but from what I have reviewed, he was exhausting to her. He was probably possessive. He probably had some issues trusting, because that's just inherent in him. And so once that relationship was over, I believe that he no longer felt normal, and he was unable to control his emotions.
So he kind of went further down after that.
Absolutely. He became suicidal again. He really wasn't involved in therapy, and again, he wasn't taking his medication, but unfortunately, and speaking to his parents and also other people that I'm aware of, especially after the pandemic, it's very difficult to get in to see a competent and licensed professional, whether it be a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a mental health counselor, And so, unfortunately, the only person that he saw was this non-licensed, non-psychologist, non-psychiatrist individual who pretty much tried to befriend him rather than teach him significant coping skills. And I'm not sure how open and honest Spencer was with him about the seriousness of his suicide. I think by the time he saw him for a second time, he had made up his mind that he was going to kill himself. And from that time period on, he didn't care whether he took medication. In fact, he was observed as being calm and comfortable more the day or the 2 days preceding the tragic event.
Is that unusual for people that are planning suicide to enter a period of where they seem to be perhaps a little more normal because the decision has already been made?
No, it's not unusual at all. The problem is they go to therapy and they say, hey, I feel great, things are good. In their mind, it's because, hey, I don't have to deal with this anymore. And so therapists, and I'm not saying anybody specific, but in general, therapists can be fooled saying, oh, he's doing better, my therapy's working, and so forth, when in reality it's because the client has pretty much definitively made up his mind as what he's going to do. And I think that's what happened. He had a specific plan. He discussed that plan with me. I think he's been consistent in terms of his plan, but his plan had nothing to do with, as far as I know, it had nothing to do with Madison in terms of hurting her, even though he communicated with her and others that he did want to hurt her, but he wanted to hurt her emotionally and wanted her to feel guilty and wanted her to feel responsible for his death. And,
So the hurt that he was referring to is the hurt that she would feel knowing that she, quote, caused him, or in his mind,
right,
to commit suicide.
That's correct.
If I may have a moment, Your Honor. Would Spencer benefit from treatment?
Absolutely. I mean, he's currently receiving treatment right now in the form of medication, but, that's just a Band-Aid. He needs intensive therapy with a qualified mental health professional. It needs to be intensive. If I had all the resources, or we had all the resources available for Spencer, I would recommend that he be seeing a therapist twice a week, that he also participate in group therapy, because that's where the social anxiety part is important. He needs to learn how to interact with others. And so those are the two main therapy goals for him.
What about medication?
Medication, yes, that's obvious.
And has Spencer expressed to you his amenability to treatment?
Yes. He now, things have changed drastically in many ways, so that he recognizes what he is capable of, what he has done because of his lack of mental health intervention. He didn't think that at the time. And again, his goal, in my opinion, was to kill himself by cutting his throat. He laid out all of that to me in our evaluation in terms of what his plan was that day. It was somewhat romantic, if you want to use that word. I'm not sure that's the right word, but his plan was to go and have his last dinner or his last meal at a place that he had frequented a lot, both with Madison and his father. He was then going to go to the beach, slit his throat, and lay there and die while watching the sky. That was his plan.
have nothing further, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Krop.
Good afternoon.
Now, I know you've been a psychologist since 1971, I believe, but you're not a neuropsychologist, is that correct?
No, that's not correct. I am a neuropsychologist.
You have a specialty or a concentration in that area, correct?
No, I couldn't see myself doing neuropsychological evaluations. They're very lengthy. They can be boring at times. But it's an area, the reason I got to Gainesville, I spent a year at the VA Medical Center at a postdoctoral internship in neuropsychology. I use neuropsychology, not routinely, and there's sometimes I will refer them out. But I do them in almost all homicide cases, and I do them in personal injury cases when a person, for example, has a head injury from a car accident. I would do it then as well.
Okay. And so, as part of your evaluations with him, I think you stated today that you saw him 8 times, but only 2 of those were in person and the rest were remote, correct?
Yes.
And then I know some of your associates also may have seen him remote, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. When it came time to administer what is what's called the personality test, not the neuropsych test, your office mailed those to him, correct?
I believe so.
Okay. And you indicated in your deposition that's not an ideal way to do it, but that's what we did, correct?
Correct. During the pandemic, telehealth became very popular, and in my situation, the reason I haven't retired, despite some people trying to encourage me to do that because of my age, but I want to continue doing forensic psychology, but one of the criteria that I would continue is that I don't go into many jails anymore, but to do a neuropsych eval, you have to do it in person.
Right.
And Mr. Kachergas arranged for me to have a private room there.
So for the neuropsych testing, which is different than the personality, you did go in, correct?
Yes.
And you talked about earlier all of the various neuropsychological tests you administered with him, correct?
Yes.
And your ultimate opinion after doing that is that Mr. Pearson suffers from no neurocognitive disorder, correct?
That's correct.
And he has no executive functioning impairment, correct?
Correct.
And you stated in your deposition that his executive functioning, obviously he's 18 years old, but his is average as relates to his peers, correct?
I'm sorry, say that again.
His executive functioning, he's an adolescent, but it's average as it relates to his peers, you would say.
That's correct, based on the testing, yes.
Right. And then when you got to the personality testing, you actually, let me ask you this, because this is the stuff that was mailed to him. So you did the MMPI-2, the MMPI-3, and the PAI, is that right?
Yes, well, there were other tests measuring depression and so forth, but those were the major personality tests.
Right, and then there was the Beck scale and stuff, okay. But the MMPI-2 and 3, you wouldn't have had him do that at the same time, right?
Correct. The MMPI-2 was not valid, so the MMPI-3, which is relatively new, I decided to give him that to see if we get any other different results.
Okay, but you didn't. That one was also not valid, correct?
Correct.
And then I'm assuming on a separate occasion he sat down and did the PAI, correct?
He did that at the same time. He did the MMPI-2.
Okay, so those 2 were given on the same day.
He did all of those personality tests at the same time, with the exception of the MMPI-3, which I gave later.
Okay. And on the PAI, again, results, you testified earlier today, the results were difficult to interpret, but in your report and in your deposition, you stated they're invalid due to the over-reporting, correct?
Right.
Okay, so he was over-reporting certain symptoms which you talked about earlier that you went and followed up on, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Now, when we get into the diagnoses, Dr. Krop, obviously, you know, you and Dr. Davis and others, major depressive disorder, have agreed on that basic diagnosis. You have some things that other experts and physicians have not, or excuse me, psychologists have not agreed with, and that's the severity and the psychotic features. Is that right? You're the only one that have added those labels, correct?
That's correct. And I think that the reason for that is I had more data, as I also said, that I don't think he is psychotic or has a psychotic disorder, but I had an opportunity to spend more time with him and have more collateral information from family. And so I think they, as I said before, as examples of that psychotic behavior, as examples of possible psychotic behavior was this paranoia, the conspiracy, and all these things that the sister told me and the family told me. But again, I don't think it's particularly relevant in my opinions.
You've said that. You said that in your deposition. You're saying that today. If it's not relevant and you're not sure about it, why would you add it to your diagnosis?
Because I didn't say I wasn't sure about it. I think that there was enough data. I didn't want to leave that out. If people are telling me that he's overly suspicious, that he's looking out the window, he talked about the voices, which I clarified later, but that he was hearing at the time. And I felt that there was sufficient data to just say with psychosis, meaning that goes along with the major depressive disorder. I never diagnosed him independently of having any kind of psychotic disorder, because I also don't think that it necessarily has any relevance to what happened with Madison.
Okay. And so one of those features, the hearing voices, you're now saying that you've looked at that again, and what he reports is not consistent with the research on hallucinations, correct?
Not consistent with what?
With the research that supports that he was truly hallucinating?
I don't believe he's hallucinating.
Okay.
I think this is more of a coping mechanism for him. He doesn't have a whole lot of people to talk to in jail.
You and Dr. Davis agree as to social anxiety disorder, as do a number of individuals, and I think that's apparent here.
Yes.
I want to move on to autism. Autism, Dr. Krop, you would agree there's two. Well, first let me back up. You did the screening test. I believe it's the GARS, G-A-R-S, or correct me?
Yes.
Okay. And that's a screening checklist that's given to family members.
In his case, I gave it to, 3 family members. The person himself could fill it out, but at the time, I just gave it to the family members.
Okay. And so that's a screening test that may tell you whether or not further examination or testing may be needed, correct?
It's not really a test. It's a rating scale.
Okay.
And I think it's almost every person that is evaluating or treating potentially autistic kids or adults uses that or some other similar kind of rating scale.
Right, and you corrected me that it's actually not even considered a test, it's just a screening scale, right?
You can talk about that. Yeah, it's a rating scale.
It's a rating scale, okay. And so you wouldn't diagnose somebody based on that, correct?
Not just based on that, no.
Right. You actually have up there the DSM-5, which is what you refer to as sort of the psychology Bible, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and that's where diagnoses come from in your profession?
Yes.
Okay. And so with autism, there's 2 different areas of criterion, and the person has to hit different ones within those 2 separate areas, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you would agree that those 2 areas are generally social communication and interaction, and then restricted and repetitive behaviors. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And I believe you testified here today and in the past that the defendant hits on a lot of those social interaction and communication criterion.
Yes.
Okay. But he does not hit anything on restrictive and repetitive behaviors. Isn't that true?
Well, according to the father, and I don't think I knew this, or I don't think I remembered this at the time of your deposition, the father, in my notes, told me when I saw him that he used to color and draw over and over and over again the same thing. And when he didn't do that, he would become anxious, and again, taking something away from him, he'd become emotionally upset. So I took that as a repetitive behavior. I know Dr. Davis, in his interview, I believe, with the father, asked him sort of a generic question, does your son have any kind of repetitive behavior? And I think the father said no. And that's one of the reasons why I had a follow-up session with the father and mother.
Okay.
And the father told me that.
So is it your opinion it is your opinion that you believe he's on the autism spectrum, is that right?
I believe that he is. I don't, a diagnosis basically is to assist in treatment. Again, I don't think the autism necessarily, it's so close to social anxiety.
Right.
The social anxiety is so obviously clear that he meets those diagnoses. So,
right.
I think that's more relevant to what happened than being autistic or being psychotic.
You keep using the word relevant. Isn't it more accurate that he's socially anxious and he's not autistic?
Yeah, I think the data certainly is more to the social anxiety. It's a pretty easy diagnosis to make in his case.
Because as you opined in your deposition, someone cannot meet all the criteria of PTSD and still suffer trauma, right?
Yes.
Okay. You shouldn't diagnose them with PTSD, but there is a other specified trauma, kind of lesser disorder, does that make sense, that you could diagnose them with?
It's when the person doesn't meet all the criteria for, and that's true for most diagnoses. There's sort of a catch-all of like unspecified, whatever the particular, or just features or traits of a particular diagnosis.
So even for all the criteria under autism, it's a more accurate and it's a better diagnosis to call him socially, that he has social anxiety disorder.
Yes, that's correct.
And nonetheless, we'll strike that. And then I wanted to note, in your report, you did list him as having bipolar disorder, which is a significant mental health disorder. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
But you sort of took that back. I don't know if it was prior to deposition or in deposition, but you no longer feel that he meets the criteria for that, correct?
After I wrote the report, and I think I saw him maybe one or two more times after that before the deposition, and I determined that he did not meet criteria for bipolar disorder.
Right. Mr. Spencer Pearson's never had any episodes of mania would be the reason why he wouldn't be bipolar.
And bipolar disorder is often seen in the family, and there is no evidence of bipolar disorder. And in fact, looking back at my report, I do not diagnose him with bipolar disorder. I indicated rule out bipolar 1 disorder, which meant I didn't have enough information at that time to make a diagnosis.
Okay. And then sort of one of the last things you touched on with counsel was the frontal lobe. You heard Dr. Rubino, and now you're here as a psychologist, and we all know, and the court is well aware of the adolescent brain. And we all agree he's 18 years old, so he's in that range. But again, you've said he has no impairment to his executive functioning. Correct?
Correct.
As an adolescent.
Based on my testing in terms of cognitive, which is primarily what I tested him for, that I couldn't say that he had impairment of the executive functioning.
So even though there may be some early signs and some damage, minor brain damage to him, it's not showing up in a clinical sense, so you can say he has a disorder to relate back to that.
Well,
correct.
I was going to say in all fairness to me, that sounds egocentric, but the testing that I did, and most of the time neuropsychological testing, does not measure the right frontal lobe, which is where Dr. Rubino said that there's a lesion, I believe. Right. So, but when I didn't see it on the testing.
Right, you didn't see it.
Flatly.
And you're familiar, as you do these tests, you said, in most cases, or a lot of cases, if you were to see cognitive impairment, executive functioning, if you would have seen that in that testing, you, as part of your job, can often actually recommend scans get done to either corroborate or not what you're seeing. If you kind of have positive results, that's often done, correct?
In this case, I would have done that knowing that he had all those concussions. Yes, I would have made that recommendation, and I did not, because it did not show up on the testing.
Well, that's what I'm saying. You knew about the head injuries, but you didn't get anything in the testing to then say, oh, wait a minute, we need scans here.
That's correct.
Okay, all right. And then lastly, Dr. Krop, at the end you kind of talked about the plan that he had told you about as far as June 3rd, and that was to go kill himself at the beach. But before he did that, he stopping at Chubby's, correct, to eat
Yes.
his last meal? Okay. In that, he told you that one of the reasons why he chose Chubby's was not only because it was important or a special place for him and his father, but it was also special or somewhere he would frequently go with Madison, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And he told you that as he sat in the restaurant that day, he was thinking about Madison, correct?
Yes, he's always thinking about Madison.
Right, and he told you that the things that she said to him always brought him comfort. He saw her in a positive light, correct?
Yes.
All right. When you questioned him about why he pulled into the parking lot and began to park and then moved his truck, he told over closer to Madison's vehicle, he just told you that he didn't remember doing that, correct?
Didn't remember a lot of things, and yes, he didn't remember that.
Okay. But you remembered going in there and eating mozzarella sticks?
He remembered going in and eating. He remembered pretty much everything up until right after he saw Madison and his mother, her mother at the door, the exit.
But you're aware that several witnesses have also said that as he laid on the ground after he attacked all three of them, that he began to steadily try to kill himself, correct?
Seems that way, yes.
Asked other people to let him die, correct? You're aware that he said that to
I
the
believe
person?
yes, I remember reading
So
that.
those are, I mean, that's a thought. I don't know how complex it is, but he's thinking
Yes.
after that, correct?
That was before he really started bleeding out. So.
You made a comment at the end of your testimony, Dr. Krop, that the defendant now recognizes, and you started to say what he's capable of, and you stopped yourself and said what he has done. But that's what you meant to say, that he's now aware of what he's capable of, correct?
He knows what he's done, yes.
Right.
And so he knows that it's important to take medication for his psychiatric disorders.
Okay. And you can't say that any of your diagnoses, and certainly not anything that we saw in the scans, directly caused him to commit the violent acts on June 3rd, correct?
They were contributors, certainly. They didn't cause him to
Right.
do this. If they caused him, then I would have said he was insane, but
Right.
he's not insane.
Okay. No further questions?
Redirect.
Dr. Krop, there's been some discussion about your testimony versus, in comparison to Dr. Rubino's, and obviously you're two different type of experts. So let me ask you this. Can you have right frontal lobe damage? Can right frontal lobe damage exist even when it does not show up in your testing?
Yes, absolutely. And let me say that, it works sort of both ways in terms of imaging and neuropsychological testing. There are many evaluations that are done by neurologists that do not show up on imaging based on the nature of the injury, and they will refer individuals for neuropsychological testing frequently because it may show up on testing, and it works the other way around. There's no perfect correlation between imaging or neuropsychological testing. If there were, then we'd only need the one to validate what the issues are.
And not to make it basic, but it would be like other medical conditions where one doctor will see one thing, not recognize it, goes to another doctor, different type of doctor. That doctor, because of their particular area of expertise, will recognize a condition that another medical professional or paraprofessional would not have recognized.
Well, I think it's more the kind of assessment that these different doctors do. And some assessments, depending on the type of assessment, will pick something up, and the other doctor might not see it because he does a different type of assessment. It doesn't mean that the disorder doesn't exist.
I don't have anything further. Thank you.
Is going to step down?
Yes, Nick.
All right, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank
You are
you.
free to go.
Thank you, Your Honor.